Thank you, Barbara, and good morning, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to be here this morning to talk to you about the role of whales in Southern Ocean ecosystems, and I want to thank specifically the conveners of this symposium for inviting me to be here. I also would like to acknowledge my co-authors here, Robert Pittman and Bob Brownell. When I was a graduate student, my advisor gave me some advice about how to give a talk at a scientific conference. And one of those pieces of advice was, tell your audience what you want them to remember and tell them right at the beginning of the talk. So as a preface to my talk, here is my take-home message. It's a pretty simple one. Whales are big and it matters. This is the title of a chapter by Peter Kariva in a relatively well-known book published a few years ago on whales, whaling, and ocean ecosystems. And when you think about the role of whales in ocean ecosystems, I think this says it all. Let's do a quick calculation. Here, what I've shown you on the left is the baleen whales and current population estimates, courtesy Bob Brownell, who walks around with this information in his head, for the Southern Hemisphere, the North Pacific, and the North Atlantic. You can total up those numbers, multiply them by the mean body mass of each of these species, and you get a total of about 15.7 million tons of whale in the world's marine ecosystems. This sheer tonnage implies that whales can play significant roles in marine ecosystems, and there's a lot of science that's been done to support that statement. I'll give you 5 examples briefly here. Cetaceans in the California current are estimated to consume 12% of the ecosystem's net primary productivity. Benthic feeding by gray whales provides habitat for benthic scavengers, prey for seabirds, and mixes sediment with the potential to alter primary productivity. Whale carcasses are known to support greater than 350 species and of deep-sea biodiversity. A decline of sperm whales in the tropical and subtropical Pacific may have resulted in a shift toward ecosystems dominated by squids and tunas. And last and perhaps most well-known, killer whales may have sequentially depleted marine mammal species in the Bering Sea. Despite this science, Peter Kariva makes the point that relatively little is still known about the ecological roles of whales in marine ecosystems, and he uses these statistics to justify that statement, looking at 4 years in one of the world's premier ecological journals, Marine Ecology. 0% of those address whale ecology, species interactions, or effects on ecosystem processes. And in a more directly focused marine mammal journal, Marine Mammal Science, from its inception through the year 2003, only 18% of the papers focused on whale science focused on species interactions or ecosystem processes. So the irony is that although whales have become a symbol of the human capacity for greedy overharvest and a rallying point for environmental activists, we know surprisingly little about their ecological role. And this is a point to which I will return at the end of the talk. Now let me take you to the Southern Ocean ecosystem, and I'll preface this by telling you that when I use the term Southern Ocean, I'm going to be talking about the waters and ice waters south of the polar front. And again, the theme of my talk, whales in the Southern Ocean ecosystem, and I'm going to take a trophic interactions perspective. I'm going to touch on whales as consumers, whales as competitors, and whales as prey. And one more definition, when I talk about whales here, I'm really going to be talking about cetaceans, all of the cetacean species in that ecosystem. So let's start with whales as consumers. The combination of great abundance, large body size, and endothermic metabolic demands make odontocete and mysticete whales some of the most voracious consumers in the ocean. As such, they have the potential to place extraordinary pressures on marine resources. When we think of consumers in an ecosystem context, we ask questions like, what is eaten, how much, and how does this consumption impact the ecosystem? And when we think of whales as consumers in the Southern Ocean, of course we have to think about krill. A relatively simple krill-based ecosystem exists in about 1/4 of the 32 million square kilometers of the Southern Ocean. How much krill is consumed by whales? That's a question that has received a great deal of attention, and there's a fair bit in the literature about this, including very sophisticated analysis and back-of-the-envelope calculations. Here's an example of the latter. For 5 species of baleen whales on the left there, their estimated abundance in the Southern Ocean and mean mass. Then you can estimate daily ingestion rate, the number of days spent feeding in the Southern Ocean, and the % of krill in diet. When you take all that into consideration, you can do a pretty quick and dirty calculation to come up with 53.4 million tons of krill consumed annually by just these 5 species of whales. Now, to put that into perspective a little bit, annually between 100 and 200,000 metric tons of krill are harvested. It's been estimated that 190 million tons of krill were consumed by baleen whales alone prior to commercial exploitation. And it's thought that on the order of 250 million tons are consumed by current populations of all krill predators. Now, with these numbers on the screen, I do need to tell you that despite much careful attention, estimates of krill consumption are invariably associated with a great degree of uncertainty. And for that reason, I'm not going to talk about biomass of consumption in terms of absolute numbers for the rest of the talk. Instead, what I'd like to focus on is how does this consumption impact the ecosystem? And I'm going to return to that question later on. Let's move on to squid. Sperm whales are known to favor squid in their diet, and in the Southern Ocean there's an estimated 10,000 sperm whales, all males. Beaked whales also prey heavily on squid, if not exclusively. It's been estimated that there are about 600,000 beaked whales in the Southern Ocean, almost all of which are Hyperidon planifrons, southern bottlenose whale. Interestingly and tangentially, this makes Hyperidon planifrons perhaps the most abundant cetacean in the Southern Ocean. And then finally, some recent data have come along to indicate that killer whales in Antarctica may also be eating squid. This is some data that just came back from this 2012 field season on type B killer whales. On the left side there you see a satellite track from a single individual that was tagged in on the 24th of January, and on the right there's a depth of dive pattern from that individual through to early February. You can see that this animal is making periodic diving bouts that are quite deep, between 300 and 500 meters. So it's possible that this killer whales down here are also feeding on squid. How much squid is consumed? And how does this squid consumption impact the ecosystem? There is so little known about squid in the Southern Ocean, in fact in squid and marine ecosystems in general, that I'm just going to tag these as big unanswered questions, and I'll return to that at the end of the talk as well. How about other species in the ecosystem, notably fish, penguins, seals, and whales? When we think of whales as consumers of these things, some baleen whales do take fish, but we're really talking about killer whales. Killer whales as consumers of these apex predators. In fact, we do know that killer whales take fish, Antarctic silverfish, but also more famously Antarctic toothfish, as in the case of the Ross Sea killer whale, or type C. Killer whales consume penguins, as in the case of the Gerlach killer whales, or type B, mini type Bs. Killer whales take seals, as in the case of the pack ice killer whale. These are big type Bs. And killer whales take whales, as in the case of type A killer whales taking minke whales. How much of these species do killer whales consume? There's an estimate that there's approximately 25,000 killer whales in the Southern Ocean. But the problem with turning this into an estimate of how much is consumed is prey specialization. As I've just shown you, killer whales are famous for specializing on prey, although recently in the Southern Ocean, the degree to which killer whales specialize on prey or switch prey has been called into question, and I'd be happy to talk with anyone interested about that after the talk. But addressing this question really depends on understanding what the distribution and abundance of killer whale ecotypes is in the Southern Ocean in order to address how this consumption impacts the ecosystem. A couple of big unanswered questions. Let me move on now to whales as competitors. Competition from any one species may profoundly affect the population dynamics and carrying capacity of another, either through its effect on their mutual resources or by direct interference. Now, when you think about competition in the Southern Ocean, immediately what comes to mind is competitive release. That's also known as the krill surplus hypothesis, probably familiar to most of you in the room. Briefly, the story goes that more than 2 million whales were removed from the Southern Hemisphere through commercial whaling. It was thought that up to 150 million tons of krill per year went unconsumed as a result of this removal of whales. That could theoretically support the addition of between 200 and 300 million penguins per year, and subsequent to this hypothesis, growth in penguin populations as well as pinniped populations were attributed to this krill surplus. What about today? Competition for krill is occurring. There are a lot of scientific examples. Here's just one. At Anvers Island, there are significant relationships between humpback whale abundance, the size, frequency, distribution of krill that are targeted by Adelie penguins, and penguin foraging success. And that relationship is shown very nicely for you in the figure on the lower right-hand side. So humpback whales and Adelie penguins appear to target and share similar spatiotemporal prey resources. Such competition can result in changes in abundance for both predator populations and prey. Here's a non-whale example. At Bird Island, South Georgia, Antarctic fur seals and macaroni penguins exploit the same size and population of krill. Yet the percentage of krill in the fur seal diet is much greater than the percentage in the penguin diet. And what we've seen in the abundance of these populations is that the penguin population is declining, significantly so. And the interpretation of these data by the scientists here are that these predators have reached the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. The competition for krill is occurring, and it is so intense that fur seals are outcompeting penguins, with penguin populations plummeting. Here's another example of the effects of competition, niche partitioning. Here too, there have been a number of studies that have supported this statement. Here's an example of one. Near the South Shetland Islands, baleen whales show a krill size-dependent relationship with krill abundance hotspots. And what you can see in the figures on the left are that humpback whales, their highest abundance is in association with hotspots of small-sized krill. For minke whales, their abundance is greatest in krill hotspots of medium-sized animals. And for fin whales, they seem to be targeting large-sized krill. So I'm going to return to this theme of competition at the end of the talk. Now what I'd like to do is briefly go on and touch on whales as prey. The ecological role of large whales as prey is the most controversial of the three potential food web pathways. And when we think about whales being prey, we're really thinking, again, about killer whales taking whales. Killer whales are the only thing that takes whales in the Southern Ocean, with the notable exception of humans, as was so elegantly talked about by Phil and Yulia. Taking the human element out of this for a moment, let me talk about killer whale predation and what it drives in the ecosystem. Now, this topic has received a huge amount of attention, especially outside of the Southern Ocean, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it here. I just want to highlight two examples of what we know has happened in the Southern Ocean, or what we suspect has, by this killer whale predation. The first is quite some time ago, this hypothesis put out there that killer whale predation may be driving baleen whale migration over the planet, including the Southern Ocean. And the second is this idea of trophic cascades, made so famous by several papers focused on the Bering Sea, but in the Southern Ocean as well. It's been proposed that commercial whaling resulted in a loss of major prey for killer whales, and prey switching of those killer whales, such that they focused first on southern sea lions and next on southern elephant seals, sequentially depleting abundance of those populations. Now, both of these are controversial and continuing to be debated today. What I want to do now is take this idea of trophic cascades and expand it out to the Southern Ocean ecosystem, and really try to wrap all of these trophic interaction perspectives up into a summary of the ecosystem consequences of consuming, competing, and predation, what we've just seen. And this is really about whales as drivers of food web restructuring. Another way of putting that is this is all about top-down forcing. It's whales causing change in the ecosystem as opposed to environmental perturbation, physical changes in the environment causing that. Now, despite its popularity among Southern Ocean ecologists 25 years ago, this top-down hypothesis, consumer effects on resources, has been largely replaced by an emphasis on bottom-up explanations. And that's valid in my own opinion, and it's going to be the subject of one of the workshops in the next 2 days. What I want to do now, though, is give you my favorite example of top-down forcing in a regional area. And this is trophic cascades in the western Ross Sea. The story goes like this. In November, Adelie penguins are incubating their eggs, and they feed on crystal krill. At the same time, Antarctic silverfish are feeding on the same prey source, crystal krill. 1 month later, in December, the penguin chicks hatch. The adults are now feeding themselves and their chicks on crystal krill. At the same time, minke whales arrive in the area, and they feed on crystal krill. 1 month later, in January, due to this heavy predation pressure on krill, the krill abundance declines. The penguins and minke whales then have to shift their prey, and they shift to silverfish. And that shift is shown in the upper right-hand graph there by Adelie penguins at one of the colonies. The dark arrows indicate the arrival of minke whales, and pretty much coincident with the shift in diet from a krill to a fish diet. At the same time this is happening, older silverfish are becoming cannibalistic, so they too are feeding on silverfish. And the final stage in the story is in February, when, due to this heavy predation pressure, silverfish abundance declines. As a result, penguin foraging duration and distance has to increase. Minke whales leave the area to forage elsewhere, and this grazing pressure on the phytoplankton relaxes, resulting in a spike in phytoplankton abundance. So this is an example of trophic cascades. It's really about how consumers and competitors can influence trophic dynamics in an ecosystem. And with that, I want to give you a quick summary of what I've gone over. So how do whales impact Southern Ocean ecosystems? They remove a huge amount of krill from the system, and maybe a huge amount of squid, penguins, seals, and whales. They impact other krill predators. They may drive evolutionary responses of their prey. And they have the potential to restructure food webs. Now I have to tell you one note about the elephant in the room. The Southern Ocean is a highly perturbed marine ecosystem. I haven't spoken of that yet, although Phil and Yulia certainly did, as well as Nick. Let us not forget, whale populations are recovering, the planet is warming, and fisheries are removing krill and fish, and they're removing whales. So what do we do in the face of all this complexity? What I'd like to do is end my talk with the big unanswered questions, and I was highlighting some of them as I was going along. I do this in the hope that these questions will provide some food for thought for the rest of today and for the workshops during the subsequent 2 days. So these are them for me. Something that you hear a lot about, not only in the Southern Ocean ecosystem, but in marine ecosystems in general, is this question, which is more important, top-down or bottom-up forcing? In my opinion, that's sort of an irrelevant question. Clearly both are very important, and both deserve a lot of attention. I do think that as whales recover in the Southern Ocean ecosystem, this top-down forcing is going to be deserving of more attention. Trophic linkages. Which direction and how strong? In some instances in the Southern Ocean, we don't even know that basic information. So I talked about squids. What are their trophic links with whales and their importance? What is the distribution and abundance of killer whale ecotypes, and to what extent do they specialize in or switch prey? And what are the indirect effects of food web restructuring? This is something that I haven't had a chance to talk about at all, but indirect effects are quite well known. And my final big unanswered question is this one. Are whales a year-round component of the ecosystem? And I'm going to end my talk with one last data slide to illustrate why I think this is an interesting question. It also has to do with some research that has come about by focusing on killer whales. This, in the lower right-hand corner, is the track of a satellite-tagged adult female type B killer whale. The tag was put on her on the 13th of February in 2010. She was down there right close to the ice edge. The tag stayed on for 109 days. Shortly after the tag was put on, she headed north at quite a quick pace. She made it all the way up to 30 degrees south latitude, and water temperatures there were 22.4 degrees Celsius. As soon as she got north of 60 degrees south latitude, her swim velocity picked up, and for the rest of the trip she swam at between 5 and 10 kilometers per hour, the entire time, leading us to believe that she was not feeding at that time. At the end of the 109 days, on the 1st of June, she returned to a spot down by the ice, very close to where the tag was initially deployed, and right as the Antarctic winter was setting in. So I like to use this as an example. I think it's relevant here because it shows us how non-lethal research techniques can challenge relatively long-held paradigms. It's generally believed that whales are not an important component of the Southern Ocean ecosystem during the winter. And I think that these non-lethal research techniques, such as the one here, can continually amaze us. So with that, thank you very much.